Thanks, you guys. Hi, my name's Joel. I'm one of the pastors here at Trinity Church. And you may go like, oh, he's the pastor and his daughter's doing that. You might go, now that makes sense. But let me tell you, I don't think anyone was as surprised that our daughter chose to do that than we were. And it's not because we didn't necessarily expect that from her character, but when they assign that she goes to a public school in Campbell, and when they assign this project, to study a career or a college, there's a lot of things that we thought that she would do, because she's talked about a lot of things, like being a veterinarian and working with kids, and we were a little surprised when she came home and said, hey, I want to do this on being a missionary. And, what are you going to do? No, there's something, no. Okay. And then it just worked out that the time that I was going to Haiti to train pastors was her winter break off. And it's a requirement of her project that she has hands-on experience with the career that she's doing her report on. And so by God's grace, we prayed about it and talked about it and decided to go. And for those of us who grew up in the church, it's easy just to kind of go, oh, yeah, that makes sense. But from the outside world looking in, that's just crazy. She's got a week off from school. And she's going to go through, for months now, has been going through the preparatory work and raising money herself in order to go and serve in a foreign country during this winter break. Just the fact that she's considering that career period is kind of a little crazy. And I think sometimes we take for granted the craziness that goes on around us. Just some examples from right here. We have a couple in our church who inherited a home that was in Hawaii. And they said no because they wanted to serve some of our at-risk kids in our Gateway Neighborhood Center. We have a young lady who graduated high school, and she decides she's going to take a gap year. That's that year between high school and college. That's the year you're supposed to travel, you're supposed to find yourself, you're supposed to, live off your parents, whatever the case may be. Where is she in her gap year? She's in Africa. Again, she had to raise support. She's been sick. It's been hard. Why? We have another couple who, for a while, were saving money to invest in their home, to kind of like redo a kitchen or something like that. And they were just about at that time where they were going to do that, and they heard about some young man who wanted to move into the neighborhood here and serve that community. And so rather than use that money for its intended purpose that they had saved so long for, they bought a house and made sure the rent was reasonable enough for those guys to do that ministry. That's nuts. Recently, I told you about a missionary friend of ours, Tom Randall, who was falsely accused. By the way, Tom is out. Amen. He was falsely accused in the Philippines. He was put in prison for that. He got really, really sick. And at one point, the doctor came in and said, dude, you're really, really sick, and we could get you in a really nice hospital. And Tom Randall said, no, God's doing something here. I think I'll stay in prison. That is craziness. And some of us who have been around a lot, that's easy to miss. But from the outside world looking in, you guys, that is craziness. Somebody who decides not to climb up the corporate ladder because they want to volunteer their time after work rather than working longer hours, or those who want to invest their twilight years not into traveling around and enjoying, but invest in the young generation. Not just, I think a lot of people do that, but I'm talking about rearrange their plans and mess with their incomes in order to do this. That is plain craziness. And let me tell you where it comes from. It comes from our crazy leader. Really, Jesus was nuts, you guys. Jesus was nuts. I know that sounds like, you can't say that. But he was, from at least the world's perspective, and sometimes mine. He was a little crazy. Let's go to the scripture and we'll prove it. I'll prove it to you. All right? We're going through the book of Mark. We're in Mark chapter 10. If you have a Bible, open to 10 verse 32. If you don't, you can borrow one of ours. It's in the seat in front of you. And if you do borrow one of those blue Bibles, it's page 716. You can also just listen along. That's fine as well. But page 716, we're in Mark chapter 10. Of course, they didn't have chapters and verses. Mark just wrote one long letter. But we put that in there so we could do what we're doing now. Everybody can find it in the same place. So we're in Mark chapter 10, verse 32. I want to set the scene for you here. Actually, verse 32 does that. It says, they were on their way up to Jerusalem, with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. I'm going to actually stop right there. So here's the scene. They're going to Jerusalem. Jesus is in front. The 12, and probably a small crowd of those who've been following Jesus for a long time now are following. And then there's a large crowd. And there's a lot of people, by the way, during this time going to Jerusalem, because there's a major holiday coming up. And Jerusalem is the party place. All right? And so it's not just Jesus and his crowd, but there's many people. And of course, you travel in a group because it's safer, because the robbers are out. So there's this huge crowd, because Jesus is a novelty. They're all going to Jerusalem, and that's just the way the world worked back then. But those who understand what's going on are a little nervous, except for Jesus. Now, what we know from, in order to set the scene, what we know is that Jerusalem is a dangerous place for Jesus and his followers. In fact, at one point, they're way away from Jerusalem, and word comes to him that a friend of his, Lazarus, is very, very sick, and begging Jesus to please come and do something about it. And initially, Jesus says no. He waits 2-3 days, and then he decides that he's going to go. You can find this, by the way, in John chapter 11 if you want to go back to it later. And in John chapter 11, it tells us when Jesus finally decides, hey, we're going to go, they go, but teacher, Jesus, whoa. Don't you remember that a short while ago, the Jews tried to stone you? They wanted to kill you, and yet you want to go back there? And Jesus goes, yep. And then they have this little discussion about, do we go with him or not? And the interesting, doubting Thomas, those of you who heard about Thomas, I got to see the holes in his hands in order to believe. It's doubting Thomas who finally stands up as they're discussing this, and he says in verse 16 of chapter 11 of John, he said to the rest of the disciples, well, let's also go with him so that we can die with him. The interesting thing is they associate Jerusalem as a dangerous place. Everywhere else, they were kind of protected with their crowds. They're away from the political center. But they understood that Jerusalem was a dangerous place for Jesus. And now, as they're getting close to Jerusalem, Jesus is out front, walking away as if they're going to Disneyland. And it says, what's the disciples? The disciples are amazed. The disciples are amazed at how, in the back of their heads, they got to be going, this is nuts. Because what is Jesus, when we were out there in a safe place where we could really mount an army, if you would, what does Jesus keep telling people? Be quiet. What does he do? He avoids the cities, right? That's the safe place to go to the cities. That's the time to build up. Now we're going to the most dangerous city possible, and Jesus is just like, all right, let's go. They are amazed. And the people behind him are downright afraid. Because what they understand is there is a conflict coming. And that is the scene that is set as we kind of go into this next part. Do you get the scene? Okay, now, before we kind of go into this, there is a pattern that has been established. You know that we've entitled this series, losing to win. And it's because of this, in this section of Mark, there has been this pattern that has been established. And I just want to kind of remind you of it. All right, this is also in your notes, but it'll come up on the screen. So back in Mark chapter 8, verses 31, 37, here's the pattern. Jesus tells his disciples, this is right after Peter says, you are the Messiah, right? Right after this, it says, Jesus predicts, he gives a prediction. He predicts his suffering, he predicts his rejection, his death, and resurrection. Right after that, there's what I'm calling a power play. That's when, remember, when Jesus said that, Peter takes him aside and says what's on all the disciples' mind, like, now wait, Jesus, we all just agreed that you are the Messiah. We all agreed on that, and you said yes. So what you just said is going to happen, that can't happen to you. No, you got it wrong. You're the conquering hero. You're not the suffering, dying type. There's a power play of saying, oh, let's change the plan here, Jesus. And then right after that, Jesus brings the disciples together, and there's a teaching. Jesus teaches his followers that they must deny themselves and take up their cross. That's what he tells them. He says, if you want to be my followers, this is what it looks like. You must deny your self-urges, and you must take up your cross and follow me. Then later in Mark 9, 31 through 37, we get the same thing. Jesus, again, the prediction, predicts his betrayal, he predicts his death, and he predicts his resurrection. Right after this, we have another power play. Right after this, we have the picture of the disciples. Again, they're walking behind Jesus. He's out in front, and they're walking behind him. And an argument raises up amongst them. And what's the argument? Who's the greatest? Who is the greatest? Why? Because Jesus is the Messiah. They're going to enter into a kingdom. And whoever the greatest is gets the seat of honor and gets to help him lead all this. And so they're arguing over who deserves that seat. And then comes the teaching. Jesus sees this, and Jesus teaches them that the last will be first, and that they should serve each other, that they should serve like a little child. He says, that they should serve little children. If you want to know what it is to be the greatest, serve the least. Now, that brings us to the third time this is about to happen in our passage today, Mark 10, 32 through 45. And again, we're going to see this pattern of prediction in verses 32 through 34, the power play in verses 35 through 41, and then the teaching 42 through 45. Anytime. It's like the day before a test. If your teacher mentions something 3 or 4 times, maybe you should study that. It's a hint. Well, Mark's giving us a hint here. If you want to know, you want to know what's important, what the message he's trying to communicate it, well, he's repeating it over and over and over again. If there was going to be a test, this is going to be on it. All right, so let's pick it up with the prediction in Mark 10, 32 through 34. This is what it says. It says, they were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. And then again, here's our pattern. He took the 12 aside, and he told them what was going to happen to him. He says, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death, and they will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him, and 3 days later he will rise. Now this is, he's talked in general terms in the first 2 times that the pattern showed up. Now he's talking in very specific terms. So this is what he says about the Jewish priests and the scribes. He says about them that A, they'll condemn him. They'll reject him. And they already kind of expect that. But what they don't expect is this second thing. When they condemn him, they're going to hand him over to the Gentiles. Now that is like low. That is absolutely, positively low. It would be like saying to a soldier in the time of in the Iraqi war, an American soldier, you've done so bad, we're going to turn you over to Al-Qaeda. You wouldn't do that to your worst American enemy. And that, in essence, is what he's saying is going to happen. And then he says, now this is when I'm handed over to the Gentiles, this is when I'm going to happen when I'm with the Gentiles. They're going to be allowed to mock me. They're going to give me the ultimate insult, and that they're going to spit on me. They're going to scourge me, and they're going to kill me. They're going to crucify me. He's very specific in what is going to happen to him. And then he says, and specifically, here's the context. This is how the Son of Man is related. Number one, he's going to be the object of all this. And then number two, he's going to rise again. There is a clear and distinct prediction. Now, that prediction comes from probably multiple places. It comes from the Scriptures. He knows the Hebrew Scriptures enough. The Hebrew Scriptures have been pretty clear about what's going to happen to the Messiah, though a lot of people have missed it. But he gets that from the Hebrew Scriptures. The other thing is, at the Transfiguration, he actually discusses what's going to happen at the end with Moses and Elijah. So part of that discussion was what's going to kind of go on in all that. And then, of course, there's just his natural relationship with his Father, direct revelation. But he specifically says what's going to happen before it's going to happen, the prediction. And then, right after this, right, is a power play. Humanity shows its teeth, if you would. Picking up in verse 35. It says, then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. Teacher, they said, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. What do you want me to do for you, he asked. They replied, let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in glory. You don't know what you're asking, Jesus said. Can you drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I'm going to be baptized with? We can, they answered. Jesus said to them, you will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with. But to sit on my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared. When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Now there's a parallel passage that also describes what happens here. It's in Matthew 20, verses 20 through 28. Matthew 20, verses 20 through 28. And in that parallel passage, it says that that John and James' mother comes and makes the request. Okay? Now you got to remember, Mark is writing primarily from the sermons that he heard Peter. So in the disciples' mind, it doesn't really matter whether or not mom came and made the request. They knew who was making the request. It was John and James. And that's the way Peter told the story. So that's what we had here. And they come to Jesus with this request. Here's the power play. It starts with a request. And the request seems innocent enough on the surface. Can one of us, when you come into your kingdom, Jesus, can one of us sit on your right and one of you sit on your left? The only thing is that in the center of that request isn't, hey, we just want to be with you, Jesus. It's, we want you to give us the stamp of approval of saying that we too are the greatest. Because in that day and time, the person who sat on the right and the person who sat on the left of the king, the right was the most important, and the left was the second most important in all of the kingdom. And as they're going into Jerusalem, they don't expect Jesus to suffer and die. That's got to be some kind of parable that they don't understand. What they expect him to do is to establish his kingdom, to be a ruler. That's how all that fear all of a sudden turns into, we're gonna see next week, into palm branches and cloaks, and because they expect him to come as a conquering hero. And so they make this request, we want to be the greatest. Now, they got a pretty good claim, because if you remember, when Jesus goes off, and he takes, out of the 12, he usually takes 3 with him. One is Peter, but he talks too much. The other 2 are James and John. And John, even in his own gospel, in the letter that he writes, refers to himself as the one whom Jesus loved. They had a great relationship with Jesus. So now's the time to kind of make the move. So they start with this request for the highest places of honor. And Jesus' answer, though, isn't yes or no. Initially, Jesus says there's a cost to your request. Let's just be clear on what you are asking. See, when you're talking about receiving that kind of honor, the way to get to that honor isn't something which we're ultimately going to find out that I grant. It is given to those, is reserved for those who drink the cup I drink and are baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with. Now, the cup refers, we're going to find out when he asks this cup later on in the garden to pass from me. The cup refers to his submission to this Father's will. Ultimately, what we're going to find out in becoming sin for us. And the baptism refers to his suffering on the cross, also for the world, for our sins. See, when he says, can you drink this cup? Can you identify with my baptism? In other words, can you handle the weight of leadership? They're thinking it's the weight of leadership. We got to deal with people. We're going to make unpopular decisions. There's going to be a conflict with the Romans. It's not going to be easy, but it's going to be tough. And but that's what leaders do. Yes, Jesus, we can lead the way that you lead. And the interesting thing is that Jesus says, well, you will drink the cup. This is verse 39, that I drink, and be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with. He affirms that. Yes, you're right. You will drink that kind of cup, and you will be baptized with that kind of baptism. In his answer. And in fact, James would be the first of the 12 disciples to be martyred, according to Acts 12, verses 1 and 2. Acts 12, 1 and 2. And John also would experience great persecution and ultimately lose his life for the gospel. But the second part of this answer is, these places that you asked for belong to those for whom they have already been prepared. He, by the way, doesn't say no, those places aren't for you. He just says that those places aren't for him to grant. They've already been granted, or they'll be granted by the Father. It's the Father who grants those positions. But in terms of getting there, he says, you know what? You ultimately will pay. You will end up doing what it is, even though you don't understand what it is. But he wants them to understand what it is. So the other 10 hear about this, and they're upset. I don't know, the Bible doesn't say explicitly, but my guess is they're upset because they didn't think of it first. We just know because they're all arguing over the greatest thing. And it was just James and John, with the help of Mom, who were the first ones bold enough to go and ask. What's he going to say? No? But he could say yes. The other 10 are just indignant. They're upset. And then comes the teaching. We have the prediction, we have the power play, and now we have the teaching. Verses 42 through 45. It says, Jesus called them together, and he said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers over the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man, he's referring to himself, did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. There are three components to this as he kind of gives his teaching. He gives the Gentile example, the disciples practice what they should do, and then his own example. First, he starts with, don't be like the Gentiles, which he doesn't have to tell them. Because that's the last thing any Jew would want to do is be like the Gentiles. It would be like me coming to you in a religious contest and saying, don't be like Congress. You'd be like, oh, I don't want to be like them. We all agree that's not a good example to follow. And that's what he's using. And how is it that I don't want you to be like them? By the way, wink, wink, nod, nod, you're being exactly like them. First, they're characterized by the way they lord over one another. They're dominating, right down to the oppression of others. I don't want your goal to get into a position so that you can lord over people. You can dominate them. You can decide their fate, if you would. And they exercise authority. They take their authority and they literally exploit it. In the name of helping the people, they really, in essence, help themselves. It's not like the disciples are clamoring for the place on Jesus' right and left because they feel like they can improve the kingdom more than everybody else. They're trying to get on the right and the left because they feel like they should be honored and deserve it. And he says, don't be like them. Be careful of the promotion attitude. Be careful of the fame and fortune goal. It should not be that way with you. Be careful of, I just want them to be happy. No, he says, this is what I want you to do. Once I find my place. 43, not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave to all. So, by the way, he doesn't say you shouldn't want to be great. And he doesn't say you shouldn't want to be first. He doesn't say that. He says, if you want to be great, and if you want to be first, this is how you do it. Greatness comes from serving, not being served. And if you want to be first, if you want to be considered above all, then take the place at the feet of all as a slave. If you want a promotion, clean the copy room. If you want to be the CEO of the company, look out for others' needs first. That, you guys, is craziness. That's craziness. If you had a business school based on these principles, you'd go out of business. Nobody want to come to your school. Even though, by the way, statistics are finding that this is a great way to lead. Just read Good to Great and the Level 5 Leader. You'll be amazed because he was basically going to teach you this principle. Jim Collins is a secular, scientific, by the numbers, this is how business work guru, and he comes up with Jesus' model of leadership. And he says, just so we're crystal clear on what I'm talking about, and just so you can't wiggle out of this is a parable, let me be clear. Verse 44, or 45, sorry. For even the Son of Man, and remember that refers back to Daniel 4, and the Son of Man comes with authority and power. That's the term he's using of himself. But he says, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And, this is the kicker right here, to give his life as a ransom for many. That ultimately, the one who should have the right place of the Father in heaven gives it all up and comes to serve, to be a slave, and to give his very life for the people who should give their lives for him. He gives his life as a ransom. And I just want to kind of take a small pause and just say, this was a plan from the beginning. But it's easy to miss because we get so fixated on, I mean, when we, as a pastor, I get questions all the time that are basically revolved around, how can I be blessed? How can I be healed? How can I be more happy? How can I make sure my children do good in school and follow God? And I don't get a whole lot of questions about how do I give more of my life away? Why? Because we're human. And by the way, I don't ask a whole lot of those questions either. Because a lot of times I don't like the answer. I mean, I got 4 kids. I'm hoping one of them does really well and help me in retirement. They all go into ministry. I'm stuck. Just as human as everybody else out there. Yes. Let me just take you really quickly to Isaiah chapter 53, just to show you what I believe Jesus shows them all throughout this, and eventually he shows, I believe, those guys on the road to Emmaus. He takes them here, I believe. It says in Isaiah 53, 10 through 12, it says this, "Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him. It was the Lord's will to cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life a guilt offering," that refers back now to the Hebrew Scriptures, the offering of a bull for the guilt of your sin. But now we're talking about a person. Makes his life a guilt offering. He will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After the suffering of his soul, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Carry their sins is what that means. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death and was numbered with the transgressors. And we're going to see that later. He'll be crucified with criminals that were guilty. For he bore the sin of many, and he made intercession for their transgressions. Or he interceded. He was, in essence, a ransom for our sin. That was the plan from the beginning. It didn't just happen. It didn't just kind of go that way. That's part of the important point about Jesus doing this 3 times, is that when ultimately Jesus ends up, the historical event that historians authenticate, when Jesus ends up on the cross and dies, to the world it was, oh my, how did that happen? But for anyone who walked with him, especially after his resurrection, go back and go, wait, that was his stinking intention all along. Guys, that's craziness. That's nuttiness. And yes, that's what he's doing. So what is the point? Not just the point of this passage, but of this section. First of all, Jesus served and gave his life for God's kingdom. He made it clear that what he came to do was to serve, and that he was going to give his life to the glory of God. But in each of these cases, after Jesus' prediction, in each of these cases, there is a power play in the teaching that establishes the second part of this point. The second part of the point is that his followers, his disciples, his church should therefore serve and give their lives for God's kingdom. That is the point of this whole thing. If you want to win, you must lose. If you want to do well in life, stop trying to do well in life and start serving. If you want to be the head of the class in the kingdom, become slave to all. If you want to have a great eternal retirement plan, stop investing in the world's retirement plan and begin to invest in the kingdom of God by giving your life to the things that last in the kingdom. And if you want to know what that looks like, look at Jesus, who, according to Philippians 2, was sitting at the right hand of God and gave it all up and humbled himself even to the cross. He ransomed. He took his life. He took his glory. He took his greatness. He took his position, and he sacrificed it all so that those who had no position, who truly deserve no glory, who don't deserve the love of God, could receive all of that. Because he ransomed his life for mine. And he ransomed his life for yours. That is good news. And when we say gospel, that's what we mean, good news. But the good news is not just what Jesus did. The good news is our response to that.